The recording is in progress.
Yeah.
Here today, back with Josh. We've thought we'd try it without videos today to see if we get better connection, because we've tried this a few times and the connections have been a bit dodgy. We wanted to talk obviously about Gurdjieff and fathoming the gist of all and everything and the Gurdjieff work. So welcome aboard, Josh. And we were going to talk about consciousness today. So what's on your mind with consciousness? Do we have
Yeah,
consciousness?
we'll give it a shot. We'll give it a shot, see how the signal goes. But yeah, I just wanted to maybe try to say some things about, I suppose, like in the not just in the Gurdjieff work, but in different traditions, isn't there? There's, spiritual traditions. There's kind of ideas about, I suppose, different kind of levels of consciousness, or different kinds of consciousness that you could say are part of this process of waking up, or man's development, or development of consciousness. So I suppose, like in the in the terms of the fourth way, like it's generally kind of said, isn't it, that man tends to live in a state of sleep, and that kind of state of sleep, or sleep consciousness, or level of consciousness, is often spoken about as, like, being the kind of automatic level. Gurdjieff mentions as, us humans in general being machines, kind of automatic. So that's the kind of modus operandi, the kind of, you could say, level of consciousness, or kind of consciousness, that maybe most of people most of the time operate in. And I suppose he speaks of that sort of state of lack of consciousness then, or automatic consciousness, in various ways. And I think some of the examples he gives is maybe something like, I suppose, our typical experience maybe of daydream, or something like that. Like, you can maybe doing something, maybe I'm washing the dishes, and at some point, I kind of, you could say, cease to be aware of the physical room around me, and that I'm washing dishes. And find I'm off in some daydream. Maybe I'm in in the Bahamas somewhere, on a beach or whatever. And of course we fail to recognize that kind of transition, then that moment where I'm not kind of no longer aware of myself, sort of washing the dishes, and I'm off in the Bahamas. So that's, you could say that kind of thing is maybe a classic pointer to the nature of this sort of automatic level of consciousness. That there can be kind of a
sleep, isn't it?
Pardon?
That would be when we're asleep.
Yeah,
We
that's a
conscious.
yeah, that's what yeah, that's kind of one definition of sleep. Is so there can be activity, there can be like, for all intensive purpose, if somebody else was in the room, they would still see me washing dishes. Do you see what I mean? Like, my body, can kind of take over and carry on washing the dishes, but in a sense, there's no one there, in the sense of someone in the room. I'm not in the room at that moment. I'm off in the Bahamas, doing whatever I'm doing in my kind of, in my dream or in my imagination. So there could still be a functional activity, in the body. And as you know yourself, or maybe anybody who drives a car knows, you can sort of go onto autopilot sometimes, where you're sort of not there, but the car, you still seem to drive the car. Evidently you don't crash, so that the body can kind of can still perform without our general sort of subjective awareness being there. Do you see what I mean? Like, again, I can be off in the Bahamas whilst I'm driving the car, and the car seems to get driven perfectly fine, and I don't crash. So that kind of automatic sort of state of consciousness then tends to be, I would suggest, that sort of average state.
So that's kind of like quite mechanical, isn't it? I've forgotten what Gurdjieff calls it. We're just doing it automatically.
Yeah. Just kind of, there's just a happening, you could say, or it's just functional activity. Again, we who, this sort of subjective eye tends to think that it's the sort of director or controller, of our lives, and tends to think that nothing can get done without it. But obviously those experiences show the opposite, that the subjective eye doesn't have to be present to enable functional activity to go on. So in general, you would say that we kind of, that's part of what we experience. We experience, you could say, drifting in and out of, you could call it consciousness, but it's just, you could say, two modes of consciousness that we generally find ourselves in. Like, we can slip into this sort of automatic, functioning, where there's no real sort of subjective eye there, although there can be the sense of that. Obviously, it's not recognized that there's no one there whilst there's no one there. And then we can experience coming back from, say, daydream to our, what we would maybe call our normal sort of waking sort of state or consciousness, where there's a sense of a subjective I and me who's here, in the room, in the physical world, and who's engaging with what's going on, So that sort of waking, our general level of waking, what we call waking consciousness, again, he would say, then Gurdjieff or other traditions, so that is, in a sense, it's just another higher level of sleep, you could say. You could look at our sort of, when we're lost in dreams, you could say, look at that as a lower level of dreaming, and then we can kind of come out of that and we come to maybe what we typically regard as consciousness, where there's a sort of a heightened sense of subject object awareness. But again, so he would say that's just, in one sense, it's another heightened level of sort of dream. It's just our sort of general waking state of waking consciousness.
So when people are doing this, sometimes they're jolted out of that sleepy consciousness, aren't they?
Yeah, like there could be different things can bring us back, from, you could say, from automatic consciousness or from daydream. Either way, like something can happen, maybe something physically, like something happens, a shock or a stimuli, or maybe even no apparent stimuli, but there can suddenly be like a raising again, a sort of heightening, you could say, in the intensity or the quality of that subjective consciousness. Again, like within the realm of the normal subjective consciousness, there can be the sense of more aware states or less aware states, you could say, or a sense of a heightened awareness, or a sense of a lessened, lower awareness, not as much awareness or not as much vividity. Again, that's a classic thing, sort of in the realm of self-consciousness, that there can be this fluctuation between apparently like more consciousness or more awareness or more sort of intensity of experience or less, and like a lot of the practices, not just in Gurdjieff work, other traditions, can be aimed at sort of either like prolonging, you could say, or heightening the kind of vividity or intensity of that sort of subject on object consciousness. Like Gurdjieff gives, well, or Gurdjieff or Ouspensky, they often give like a description of, you could call it self-remembering, as a sort of a heightened awareness of the subject and the object. Again, there's a sort of that idea that in our normal sort of state of attention, it's just kind of one-way attention. Our attention is just directed to whatever it is that we're looking at with the eyes, or I could be aware of a physical object, or my mind could be on a feeling, or my attention could be on a thought. But in that form of attention, it's just kind of one way. The attention is kind of focused on whatever the object that it's focused on. And you could almost say that in that form of attention, though there can be an awareness of whatever the object is, and there can be functionality, there's no kind of quote unquote self-awareness in that operate. There's no kind of really dual arrow attention, in the sense that there's not really an awareness of the subject as well as the object. There tends to be just a sort of collapse of the attention into the object, or objects, not just physical objects, but again, the thought or a feeling. So with like some of the effort that, the efforts that we can apply and practicing the work and things, we can try to sort of enhance or develop that state of consciousness or that form of attention where there's both an awareness of the subject and the object. It's a kind of I think Ouspensky describes it as a sort of a two-way attention. There's an attention going out to whatever it is that we're aware of, but there's also, you could say, an attention coming back, to the subject. There's an awareness going from subject to object, but also in the opposite direction. It's kind of an awareness, you could say, going from object to subject, And again, they describe that sort of state of consciousness as kind of, you could say, a higher one, obviously, than when attention is just sort of one way, when there's an awareness of just the object or whatever we're aware of, or when there's kind of no awareness at all, when we're just completely sort of absent, in the general sense of it.
So most of the by like the Janus face. I think I've said it right. When one's looking to the left and one's looking to the right.
Oh yeah. That can be that sort of it brings an extra like sort of dimension. Like someone could do that. Like could experiment it with it now. They could be like listening to what we're saying, and as they do that, they can try to draw some of their attention to themselves. Let's say the subject then, you know, they can try and intensify that sort of simultaneity, like trying to be aware of whatever I'm aware of, the content, you know, of awareness, but or attention, and also try to bring some attention to attention then itself, or some awareness to awareness. You know, there can be it sort of brings an added kind of dimension to experience. You know, it's like you go from almost like, I don't know, like one dimension or a flat, you know, screen on a picture on a flat screen to then like suddenly having an experience of an image with depth. You know, it's like it does bring a kind of an extra sort of dimension to it. And that is generally what they would kind of describe, or appears to be the description of self-remembering, where there's both, you could say, an awareness of I, the subject, as well as the object, a kind of equal awareness of both. And from that, there can be a kind of a collapse, you could say, of the subject and the object, or at least there can be a collapse of the general sense of separation between the subject and the object. Yeah, in the general kind of subjective consciousness that we experience for most of the time, there is this apparent sort of separation between the subject and the object, you know, or the subject regards whatever it's experiencing as kind of other to, you know, other than itself, you know. So there's you know, again, roughly speaking, there's a sort of the realm of automatic consciousness where you could say there's no one there, or there's just this kind of one-dimensional sort of operation of attention where it's just attention is just kind of one way, or you could also say that attention is just kind of like identified with or lost in whatever it's aware of, content. And then there could be another, you know, quote unquote higher state of consciousness, or a different kind of consciousness, where there's both an awareness of the subject and the object. But that, again, that kind of consciousness can have a sort of a spectrum of kind of intensity, like, you know, again, there can be experiences of like more awareness or less awareness that still operates in that sort of subject and object realm, or like dual arrow attention. There could be like more vivid experiences or less vivid experiences, but they still operate on that sort of plane, if you see what I'm saying.
Yes.
So like,
isn't this what we're trying to attain to?
Well, that's Gurdjieff says that the state of like kind of what he calls self-remembering, which we could say is this sort of balanced attention between subject and object. He kind of says that should be our, you know, a kind of a normal, you know, state of consciousness. Like he often says that that's like man's birthright. You know, that almost should be our kind of, you could say our base. You know, would be the basic state of consciousness, the base state of consciousness for like what he might call the normal man. But obviously, he says the way that, you know, we've come to function for various reasons, we don't experience that as the natural state. Like that kind of state of self-remembering is kind of above, you know, our ordinary state. As he says, we often can fluctuate between sort of automatic states of consciousness and states of self-consciousness or self-remembering. You know, again, he says there's kind of like a state of consciousness of, like, you could call it sleep then, whether like deep sleep in dreams, or like automatic sleep in the waking state, where we're sort of in a state of dreaming. And then he says there's another state above that, which he kind of calls self-consciousness, which is this kind of realm of subject-object consciousness. And within that realm of self-consciousness, there can be different kinds of relationship, or you could say like degrees of relation, or kinds of relation between the subject and object. Like that, you could call it the state of self-consciousness, but again, that makes it sound like as if it's just one, you know, it just has one kind of content to it. But really, that state of self-consciousness can have a spectrum. Again, there can be sort of degrees of self-consciousness, you could put it that way, or degrees of intensity, or just these different kind of degrees of contact or relationship between the subject and the object. So that kind of that spectrum operates still within the form of self-consciousness. And then he talks about beyond like self-remembering and self-consciousness, as he calls it, there is what he calls objective consciousness, you know.
Yeah.
So again, that kind of goes beyond this, like the subject and the object altogether. Like, again, you could say that the sort of defining characteristic of self-consciousness or self-remembering is that there is this sort of dual arrow attention going on that's relating the subject and the object. There's still a subject and object there, but they're just in a new form of sort of relationship, you know. And that again, that sort of, there can be different kinds of relationship between the subject and the object in that level of consciousness. But objective consciousness then, which is going to be even harder to talk about, goes beyond the subject and the object altogether. There's no subject there in the normal sense of the idea of a subject, because a subject generally implies an object. So in the objective consciousness, yeah, that's beyond the kind of apparent division or relationship between the subject and the object.
Because I think Ouspensky even said it's very difficult to explain this, isn't it? Because unless you've experienced it,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I suppose the sort of other traditions can be helpful. Some of their teachings and where they talk about it, like the kind of, there's the Eastern tradition that say talks about us as having, like, again, they kind of talk about it in a similar way, that we tend to experience a subject object consciousness, and they speak of, I suppose, in the Eastern tradition, what they would call objective consciousness is kind of, they would say, consciousness aware of itself, or awareness aware of itself. They kind of tend to talk about that as enlightenment, in those kind of traditions, or like they would equate it with what they call the self, the capital S, like objective consciousness would be the consciousness of the self. And at that level, they don't like speak about multiple objective consciousnesses. They only speak about it as kind of a singular. Or another way of talking about that objective consciousness would be like unity consciousness. In other traditions, it's the consciousness, you could say, of unity. And again, or like wholeness. That doesn't allow for this kind of presence of the subject and the object. That can be present in self-consciousness.
That's funny you said, because I was about to say to you, is this when you feel that you're a part of everything and the universe, and then you started talking about the wholeness?
Yeah, well, like objective consciousness. He kind of speaks about it as being the only thing that can deal with real unity, you could say, or wholeness. Like, I think he was maybe talking about. I think he was talking about symbols. Like he says that man can be given like symbols for reality or for unity, like the enneagram and stuff. But he says really to kind of understand them, you'd have to have this sort of objective or unity consciousness. Because otherwise, if we're just approaching those kind of symbols, then from this kind of like self-consciousness, subject-object consciousness, then that can only experience and only kind of knows division. It can't handle, you could say, real unity or wholeness. Do you see what I mean? Because it's very functioning, works by a kind of a form of separation. So yeah, he says, like, in order to deal with wholeness, or you could say to understand wholeness, you'd have to be, the sort of at the level of objective consciousness.
Well, that makes a lot more sense for me, actually, because definitely in the last few years, a lot of people want to talk about symbolism, and I've been a bit concerned about what people think about certain symbols, including the Enneagram. And as you know, over the last 50, 60 years, the Enneagram's been used in ways that I don't think WGF meant at all, but that's because they're not using it in an objective sense.
Yeah. Well, it's like, it's hard for people to use, like, say, a symbol objectively, because you could say, well, the only way for it to be sort of used objectively they'd have to be used by objective consciousness. Do you see what I mean? But that's not the consciousness, or doesn't appear to be the consciousness of, let's say, most people. So obviously we're working with those symbols kind of from a mixture of the states of sort of automatic, habitual consciousness and self-consciousness. Like, you could say that most of those like systems or teachings and expressions, they kind of exist for the the person who's in the state of self-consciousness. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you can only work, you can only work with those teachings in a sense from that level, because you could say, well, if you're in objective consciousness, then, well, you wouldn't need to be working. You'd have the answer, so to speak, so you wouldn't be like seeking the answer through using these symbols and stuff. And of course, like, if you're using the symbols in self-consciousness, which is what, well, people probably will be, then yeah, there's bound to be some sort of level of error or distortion, precisely as he says, because whatever way it's being used is from the point of view of like separation and division. whereas you could say they're trying attempts to express wholeness,
What do you think about, because I often look at symbols. I was kind of trained to, you're supposed to kind of meditate on them or look upon them so that they go into your subconscious. Do you think that was something Gurdjieff was also?
Yeah, like that's very much the way he talked about it. Like he says, you can ponder them, you can engage with symbols in different ways and ponder them in different ways, and maybe like the more ways the better. But all the time he was pointing to the need for them to pass to like what he called the subconsciousness. Again, it's what he called the real consciousness. So you could perhaps look at the subconscious as maybe like objective consciousness. We're trying to, I suppose, through the engaging with the symbols through our self-consciousness, we're hoping that they could stimulate, let's say something deeper, the subconscious or objective conscious. You're hoping that there can be a response. You might say, all right, that it could awaken something. But again, they tend merely to sort of, people tend to engage the subjects, obviously, generally from sort of self-consciousness. And that can often just simply perpetuate itself. Do you see what I mean? Like a person kind of like spinning on the spot, they can just keep, he mentioned something about the formatory apparatus, saying that it has almost like this almost infinite capacity to create a sense of like new insight or, new experience, you see. And he tends to say that that's what's operating in most of our, you could say, like thinking and pondering. So again, there can be this kind of apparent like endless cycling in self-consciousness where we're like, we're engaging with these teachings and we seem to be perhaps getting new apparent deeper understandings, but in one sense it can just be like, what would they call it, like a hiding to nothing, like it can just be a spinning on the sort of spot, like obviously he says like you can't get to sort of people don't like to hear but you can't get to like objective consciousness from self-consciousness, just in the same way that you can't get, like say when you're in daydream, obviously if you're completely in daydream you can't make yourself self-conscious. Do you see what I mean? Like it's not like I can be in daydream and then say I'm recognizing I'm in daydream and then say, okay, right now I'm going to come out of daydream now and become self-consciousness, because obviously the being in the automatic state, there can't be any sort of kind of self-awareness in that sense that I'm in the automatic state, because that would naturally bring you out of it, So in that same way, he says, in a sense, there's nothing you can do to move from self-consciousness or degrees of self-consciousness to objective consciousness, because again, all those efforts, they're of the self, the subject who exists in subject-object consciousness, So again, all there can be different practices and stuff that people can do, and they can kind of develop self-consciousness, and they can make your experience better. Obviously, like people tend to live in, you might say, various states of suffering, and so if there's more self-consciousness there, level of kind of self-remembering, then something can be sort of developed that can handle, you could say, life and situations without, going into so much suffering. Or if there is suffering, it can handle it. There isn't that same degree of turmoil. But again, it still represents a kind of a big step, going beyond self-consciousness to objective consciousness, And again, like I suppose in his terms, like the Kesdjan body, like what he speaks about in Beelzebub's Tales, would kind of relate to that sort of level of self-consciousness. Like the Kesdjan body, you could say, is the body of self-consciousness, and that self-consciousness can develop. It can kind of expand or develop its richness, and you could like link that with the development of like that Kesdjan body, But so you could look at that Kesdjan body as a body of sort of self-consciousness, that form of sort of subject-object consciousness or dual arrow attention consciousness, and what he calls then, like in Beelzebub, the body of the soul, and he also links it to, would be like objective consciousness again, but that's kind of almost like, again, to self-consciousness, it's almost impossible to picture what objective consciousness would be like, because again, the self-consciousness always splits whatever it's thinking about up it divides it. Do you see what I mean? So again, there's this it kind of imagines that there would be a subject, if you like, who would be in some higher state of sort of all-knowingness, or I don't know, whatever ideas there might be about what objective consciousness means. And I suppose in like the Eastern tradition, they do speak about objective consciousness as that which is conscious all the time. That which doesn't sort of that which is present regardless of like waking, dream, and deep sleep. So again, like you could say that by its very nature, then if it's present regardless of the states of waking, dream, and sleep, or it doesn't undergo them, then it's by that very nature it's not of the kind of subject object consciousness.
Well, also with daydreaming, I remember I'm sure it was Ouspensky was saying this is a real waste of energy, especially if it's not constructive. We put too much emotions into daydreaming and it just drains out energy. So we need to stop
Yeah.
daydreaming, people.
Well, yeah. I mean, it can be like. I mean, Gurdjieff, in one sense, he says there is almost a you could rationally, so to speak, logically, give a justification for positive daydream. Because you could see why people would be attracted to it because it gives you a positive experience. But then he says, well, negative daydream, would be seen like from his way of looking at it, complete insanity because you're causing yourself, I mean, not deliberately, but through the daydream, more suffering. I'm imagining some suffering or some negative events. So I make, obviously, yeah, I just make things worse for myself. I put myself under more suffering. So yeah, like it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to escape sort of daydream, but we can certainly try to recognize the uselessness or the added suffering that comes from, you could say, negative imagination. But again, I think Gurdjieff or maybe Ouspensky, they say there's no real there's no necessity for us to experience negative emotion, or what they tend to call negative emotion, or these states of it. And again, that kind of links to self-remembering. Like if there's a strength of self-consciousness, of this kind of subject-object consciousness, there's a strength of that, then there can't be any sort of any negativity or any negative emotions in the way that we tend to experience them, because there can't be that kind of that particular kind of inner division. Like if there's someone consciousness in self-consciousness, then they're not going to have any motive to engage in like negative emotion. That only kind of the movement to negative emotion, or you could say that the motivation only kind of happens in lesser, you could say, the automatic state of consciousness, really, or that kind of habitual state of consciousness where there's just this sort of running of patterns. Like they say that most of the negative emotions, they really only come from negative self-judgment, ideas that we've acquired really from other people. It's just like this habitual programming. I suppose maybe like, was it Jung or maybe Freud or whatever, they would speak about it. It's sort of like the super ego. There's just this kind of running, ongoing self-judgment, and that's what kind of produces these negative emotions.
Yeah, I can see how I used to let my imagination run riot in negative ideas and thoughts and things, and how it must have just drained me as a young person. But I think
Yeah,
we're going to run out of time in a few minutes. So, should we try and end on a positive note? What are we doing with our consciousness?
well, I mean, in one sense, the positive, like in these teachings, I mean, again, it's hard to hear from the sort of position, of the normal, I guess, the general seeker. But the good news is that they say that this objective consciousness, if you like, or unity consciousness, is present all the time. They really say that that's what I mean, that's what you're experiencing all the time, or it's only by virtue of that you can experience anything. Do you see what I mean? So although that's not necessarily, in one sense, it's good news to the seeker, but in the other way it's not, because the seeker can't, well, obviously he can't accept that, because that's why he's seeking. He doesn't recognize, you could say, the objective consciousness that's already here, or the unity, let's call it wholeness. And that's because he doesn't recognize that, or experience that. That's obviously what brings his seeking. So again, it's just trying to highlight this point that there is something beyond what people in the work and stuff tend to call self-remembering. There is something beyond that, but obviously it's radically different it's not just like a heightened state of self-consciousness. Do you see what I mean? A lot of people, I think, can think that objective consciousness is just some higher or better version of the kind of consciousness that they experienced and all the consciousness that's present in self-consciousness and self-remembering, So the good news is that, that there is unity, and you could say you are whole already, complete. But the bad news is that we don't tend to want to hear that, as seekers. It's hard to accept that.
Well, hopefully our listeners do, because they are truth seekers and they're trying to find the way. We're going to run out in a moment, so just tell everybody where we can read your blog.
But yeah, it's on the the WordPress site, and I think if you just type in Gurdjieff and Beelzebub, like as one word, maybe like .wordpress or WordPress.Gurdjieff and Beelzebub, hopefully that'll take you to the page. But the actual sort of title of the page is just Beelzebub's Tales, Gurdjieff and the Work.
Excellent. I shall put a link down below. I want to thank you very much, Josh. It's been really
interesting. Thank you.
Do another one about this very subject. I think it'll have a lot of comments. And I would like to thank everybody for listening, and we shall speak again soon.
Right, ta-ta.